Good. Well, welcome everyone to this Jesuit Forum, Reading Forum number 4, what we call a series, Socially Aware Faith Through Love of Reading. And today we're going to be focusing on the book Structures of Indifference, an Indigenous Life and Death in a Canadian City. You can't see my Mary Jo Logan, McCallum, and Adele Perry, a book from a few years ago. But we thought this would be an important book to revisit again. We can't forget the books that were published a few years ago on the wisdom that has been shared with us particularly on this topic of so. Before we begin, let's begin with the land acknowledgement first, and then I will introduce Niigaan James Sinclair, who's going to help us to have a more deeper appreciation of structures of indifference. So I like to have a more personal land acknowledgement rather than just a simple formula. And so we would like to acknowledge that the Jesuit Forum, located in what's known as Toronto, Toronto, is located on the traditional territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Huron-Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto is governed through the Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. And as someone myself who has personally lived on this land for many years, I'm grateful to experience its natural beauty and resources, and its many beautiful ravines on the shore of beautiful Lake Ontario, a place known and respected for its cherished tree canopy and agricultural lands. And this land has provided me with a place to live, study, and work, for which I'm grateful. And I recognize that this privilege of living here comes from the stewardship and care of the Indigenous peoples who have lived here for millennia. And I remain committed to learning more about the rich histories and diverse cultures of the Indigenous communities in this region. Their resilience, traditions, and contributions continue to inspire and educate me. And just finally, in my own personal life and vocation as a Jesuit priest and representative of the Jesuit Forum for Social Faith and Justice, and a teacher at Regis College, which is part of the University of Toronto, I strive to support reconciliation efforts by actively participating in community events, supporting Indigenous-led initiatives, and also educating myself and others about the ongoing impacts of colonization and learning about them as well, particularly through Jesuit forums and in my capacity as a teacher. And I pledge to respect and honor this land and its first inhabitants, acknowledging their enduring presence and contributions to our collective future in the spirit of truth and reconciliation. And so I invite you to silently or in the chat to acknowledge the traditional lands upon which you reside and have the privilege to call home. So again, thank you everyone, Miigwech, first of all, for Niigaan for being here with us on this fourth reading forum, and to help us more deeply appreciate structures of indifference and the realities that Indigenous peoples continue to face in the midst of indifferent structures, our organizations, governmental, non-governmental, in which Indigenous peoples are forced to, endure. And this, just briefly, we felt at the forum that this would be good in the spirit of truth and reconciliation to learn a little more deeply these realities that Indigenous peoples face in urban centers, but throughout Canada, but particularly in this story of in the medical system, in our hospitals. And we asked Niigaan James Sinclair to join us because he resides in Winnipeg and he knows the city of Winnipeg well. And this is a story that takes place in Winnipeg. So Winnipeg is very much a character in this story. And so I'll just give a brief introduction to Niigaan James Sinclair. Many of you may know him in various ways. He comes from the Treaty 1 Anishinaabe territory. His family comes from Selkirk originally, just north of Winnipeg. He is a professor at the University of Manitoba, award-winning writer. And he was, I just want to bring this up, I know it's a bit maybe older, but Monocle Magazine voted him one of the top 20 most influential people in Canada. And I bring that up because his father is Murray James Sinclair, and he wrote in his memoirs of when he was voted one of the influential people's leaders in Manitoba. He revealed how he wanted to share the news with his wife, Niigaan's mother, and well, early in the morning, and his mother made a joke to Murray, something to the effect that how can you be the seventh most influential person in Manitoba when you're not you're not the seventh most influential person in this home. So I found that kind of funny. In 2019, he was won the Peace Educator of the Year from the Peace and Justice Studies Association and from Georgetown University in Washington. And he's you'll hear him on various media channels, the Power Panel, CBC's Power and Politics, CBC's The Current, and APTN's Truth in Politics. And he would describe himself as a recovering secondary school teacher, something that I can identify with. And just more specifically, Niigaan by Penguin Press described him as a provocative and revolutionary person, writer, thinker on the issues impacting Indigenous cultures, communities, and reconciliation in Canada. And in his very recent collection, Winnipeg, Visions of Canada from an Indigenous Center, described as a place he calls ground zero, Winnipeg, of Canada's future, revealing the complex history and contributions of the city alongside radical solutions to injustice and the violence found there. It's based on years of columns that he's written for the Winnipeg Free Press. And Niigaan wrote about the resilience of the Indigenous peoples through his meetings with their creators, leaders, and everyday people striving to preserve the beauty of their heritage day in and day out. And it won recently the 2024 Governor General's Literary Award for Nonfiction just a few months ago. And just finally, focusing now on Structures of Indifference, it examines an Indigenous life and death in Winnipeg, Brian Sinclair, what it reveals about the ongoing history of colonialism today. In September 2008, Brian Sinclair, a middle-aged, non-status Anishinaabe resident of Winnipeg, arrived in the emergency room of a downtown hospital, and over a 34-hour period, he was left untreated and unattended to, and from which he ultimately passed away. He died from a treatable infection. And the writers McCallum and Perry present the ways in which Brian Sinclair, once erased and ignored, came to represent a singular and largely dehumanized ideas about Indigenous peoples, modernity, and decline in our cities. So it's a story that tells about ordinary Indigenous peoples in the city of Winnipeg through Brian Sinclair's experience. And so this is a very place-based story, Winnipeg rooted to specific injustices and racism that Indigenous peoples continue to face. And so this is why we asked Niigaan James Sinclair to join us and to to help us better appreciate, if that's the word, these continuing realities that Indigenous peoples face. So Niigaan, miigwech for joining us, and in appreciation, I'd like to offer you this gift of tobacco by Zoom, of course, but miigwech.
Okay, so bonjour everybody. Bonjour Niigaan, Niigaan Indigenous cost na negotiation do devni memon na mumayain. Bonjour Shonsak to Komasak. Misha and Gisha Gibon. Beachy Nibitway the Dallas. It's nice to be here. It's nice to share with you this e-space. I'm coming to you from Saskatoon. I'm not in Winnipeg actually, so I am in Saskatoon, about to give a keynote in a couple hours in a building just that way. It's the big convention center. There's a few thousand people in town for the I don't know, it's the Association of Higher Learning at Post-Secondary Institutions or something or other. I don't know what the name of it is. So it's just, they're a bunch of academic people. And so I'm speaking about my book and a few thousand people in a couple hours, but I'm happy to sort of talk about this very remarkable, really worthwhile, excellent study that was done by my colleagues Adele and Mary Jane. And I'm very pleased to talk about this book. I haven't spent a lot of time talking about this book because, I mean, you know, things get busy and so on and so forth. And it also, when the book came out, it was a time period in which I was very, very busy. So, and so I was trying to figure out exactly what I was doing in those days and why I didn't teach this book. Because this book, I kept reading this book again for the preparation for this session, and I was like, "Why? This is exactly what I want to teach my students." And so, I've certainly revitalized my interest in the book, and as I'm putting back together or reassembling a book that I put together a number of years ago called Manitowobble, which is the first and only historical anthology of Indigenous writing in Manitoba. I kind of feel like this is going to be a very influential part of reassembling the introduction to that book, which is a book that an anthology I put together with Warren Carey a number of years ago. 2010, I think we put that book together when I was still a graduate student. And this book is very good, you know, it's excellently researched, but it's also a great story about a very tragic event that happened in Winnipeg. And as the conclusion points out, tragedies keep happening in the healthcare system in Manitoba. And so I'm going to get to that in just a minute, but I have personal investment in both this issue, but then also the way in which Brian Sinclair's life existed, because I'm not a relative of Brian Sinclair, although he may be a relative because his family comes on the east side of Lake Winnipeg. And through that area is where we have Simards. It wouldn't be through the Sinclair line, but it would be through the Simards. And because he has relationships in Saugeen and relationships in Pine Falls and Simardville or Manicatogan, there is likelihood that he's some distant cousin, but not through Sinclair's, through probably the Simard line. And then on top of that, I also helped with this book when it was in production. I didn't help substantially with it, but if you go through the acknowledgements in the back, I have a very brief thank you from Adele and Mary Jane, because I helped in some of the final stages of the book. As they were just fact checking for the most part, they asked me about to contribute some thoughts on some sections, and so I did. Now there's 4 things I want to talk about in my very short window that I have with you for tonight. As I mentioned before, I have a keynote that I'm doing shortly, so I'm only with you for about an hour, or maybe a little bit over an hour. And so we'll try to get this done as efficiently as possible. But I'm going to talk about 4 different things that I think are worth considering in the book. And I'll call them themes, but they're really, I think, the major arteries, that the theoretical kind of arteries in the book, like the things that go through all the sections of Brian Sinclair's life, but also I think every Indigenous person's life in Manitoba. Not all of us have a tragic end in the way Brian Sinclair certainly did, in being a subject of what Mary Jane and Adele, or Dr. Perry and Dr. McCallum point out as structures of indifference, which is the worst manifestation of settler colonialism. But we all have experiences of dealing with institutions, and those institutions which are taught to not see us, but then when they do see us as the something to be eradicated, something to be treated auspiciously, or treated in such a way as we are told that we are never welcome. Now, my father, who is, you heard Trevor speak a little bit about him just a minute ago, former senator, former head of the TRC, former judge, Murray Sinclair Ibon. We say Ibon because he passed away in November, my father, very sadly, in an intensive care unit, palliative care unit, actually, and as his body just gave out on him. He was the first of every room he went into. That's the best way I can describe my father. What that means is that he spent his whole career encountering, engaging, undermining, resisting, creatively fighting, with a lot of sass, all the reasons no one looked like him before in that room, or no one was like him in that room before. For instance, every time he would converse, he would say to Manitobans, this is an important issue for you, to think about the way that this province treats Indigenous peoples. And people would not listen to his long descriptions of what violence looked like on communities, like, for instance, in the violence that Brian Sinclair experienced. But they were debating the merits of the violence, of whether Dad was telling the truth. Because there was such profound ignorance in Manitoba, particularly in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, 90s, even into today. There was no conversation of the intricacies of the healthcare system, because all there was, I don't believe you. I don't believe this is happening. And I'm going to question that you are out to get some money, or you're out to try to get some sympathy of some kind, or you're trying to get into power in some way. And so the way that my dad always dealt with this was that he had to be creative and innovative. He had to be sassy and funny. He had to tell stories. What that means is that those of us who are still the first in the rooms that we enter as Indigenous peoples, as I am today, the first of many rooms that I enter into. Most of us that are in our 40s, we are still the first ever Indigenous person to enter into that room, or boardroom, or classroom, or whatever it looks like. We have a critical mass now, so we don't have to do as many fights as we had in the past, because Dad and his generation did a lot of that first fights for us. But that means that we have the job to experience and change, not just the first moments of conversing the why, but it's the conversation of how. Now, my generation, those of us who are in our 40s and our 50s, we are entering into power positions. I'm a professor, I'm a columnist. I work with dozens of organizations in Manitoba, curating art exhibits, buildings, museums. I just finished the installation of the Royal Aviation Museum of Western Canada, all the Indigenous displays. I also just curated the Fort White building in South Winnipeg, which is the only urban bison herd in any Canadian city. We can change the room, but we need allies. We need supporters. And this is, I think, the epitome of what I want to start out to talk about the book is. This book is made from an allyship between a Canadian scholar and an Indigenous scholar. Before we even talk about Brian Sinclair overall, I think pedagogically, what's worth talking about is that this book is a remarkable moment of seeing an Indigenous and a Canadian scholar working together to fight institutional racism, to point it out, and then to seek to create a path to eradicate it. And this is very much a labor in which they did not profit from this. All the money, in fact, went to Niigaan, this urban Indigenous organization. They're not personally profiting from this. As Trevor has mentioned, this book has not received the sort of wide-scale attention, even though it is an excellent account, it's excellently researched and so on. It's a small novella, if anything. It's a small sort of novella-style book. But it is a critical contribution because of this fact alone. It is two scholars, both of them a little bit older than me, but they are committing to a process of relationality, working together to get something done inside of the rooms. They're not debating, and they're not putting up with debates of, is there racism in the healthcare system? Because as they aptly prove, and you don't even need to prove it, because the treatment of Brian Sinclair is so inherently, deeply, absolutely racist that there's no debating that. There's no like, oh, well, those were overworked healthcare system workers. Nope. No one sits that long in the same spot for 30 hours in a ER room, unless you are completely neglected. You have to overtly, like, mentally ignore them. You have to work hard to do that. There's no overworkedness. There's no, oops, we missed out. There's no, oh, we screwed up with the triage. As the book points out, none of that holds any water at all, and takes no time defeating those arguments. And I think that's a real big first point of departure for this book, is the relationship between an Indigenous and a Canadian scholar working together to try to make the country better and doing a lot of heavy lifting. Now, the book spends a lot of time on the second theme, which is the notion of settler colonialism. And I don't like using this term. I'm not a fan of using this term. I know that people like Audra Simpson and so on have used this term a lot. I don't ever use the term settler, and I don't ever use the term racism in my work, because for the main purposes is, I think I'm interested in conversations that open up possibilities for dialogue. And I think people immediately shut down when both of those words are used. And so I don't use those terms. It's not that I don't talk about those things. It's just that I don't use them. And I clearly am talking about settler colonialism in everything I ever do, but I don't use the term because I think that one of our responsibilities is not just to point out the truth, but also to make the truth something understandable for people so that they hear it. And I learned that directly from my father. I learned that my father did not walk in a room and call people white supremacists or full of white privilege, or say, hey, you all stole the land. But he was absolutely talking about those things. He was pointing things like white supremacy out. He was pointing out things like privilege and power, and the implications and the causes and the outcomes of those things. And he absolutely was talking about stolen land almost his whole career. And a lot of my colleagues have deep suspicions or disagreements with me over this issue. I just think that we have a responsibility as intellectuals, as people who are having conversations with people who are often coming to these ideas for the very first time. And I want to create a big tent. I want to create a big method of change in which we can all converse together on things that are not the faults of individuals. And that's what settler colonialism points out, is that the Brian Sinclair case is not about pointing to one individual nurse or doctor or triage person and saying, oh, it's their fault. Because that's not how racism works. That's not how systemic racism works, or that's not how settler colonialism works. It's a structure. It's not an event. It's a whole series of things that are all operating together. So I think this is a very empowering idea. But I wouldn't be using it because I actually think it undermines its own power by identifying itself as identifying it in the term settler, meaning, oh, well, the problem is white people, or the problem is European arrival, or the problem is Canadians. I think it's much bigger than that, because I've seen, of course, Indigenous peoples who can act brutally and terribly, and often divisively. I've often seen newcomers who come from oppression and racism in countries like Rwanda or the Philippines or Africa or South Africa or Nigeria, wherever. And they come to Canada and they suddenly forget all the oppression that they had experienced firsthand and start pointing to other peoples as if they're the problem in a society of why they can't get a job, or why it is that their business isn't doing as well, or why is it that the taxes are high, whatever it might be. Now, settler colonialism gives us the understanding that this is a structure, and therefore there's a whole bunch of influences in it. And some of them can be tied to particular people at times and moments, but it's actually a mindset, and then therefore the structures that come out of that mindset. A kind of way in which there is an implied way in which Canadians are created into thinking in particular patterns that then reinforce power and privilege. Now, I really liked, there was a quote in here, but I can't, oh yeah, right here. This is my favorite one, the whole book. It says here that, this is Adele Perry and Mary Jane McCallum. They say, we try to get beyond an unhelpful debate about whether it was individual or structural racism that killed Brian Sinclair. Rather, we insist that settler colonialism and the structures of indifference that produces and is maintained by are always both. That's the key of understanding settler colonialism. And so I hope that term is useful to you. Not because, you won't hear me using it very often, but it has to be addressed because it's what the authors point out in this book. But it gives you an understanding that what they're talking about is something much bigger. And it happens so frequently. And it happened to myself. So my father had many, many health problems. So one of the things that he had in his later years was his gallbladder failed on him. And of course, then he had a gallbladder failure. You know that it's very painful. You have to often sort of lie flat in order to relieve the pressure. And if you lean over like this, like you're typically sitting in a chair, it's excruciating. So my father, we took him to the, not the Health Science Center, which is what the subject of the book is, but the Seven Oaks, emergency unit, whereas one of the other ERs in Winnipeg. And my father, of course, entered and was accepted quickly because they thought maybe he was in cardiac arrest. And then he went into a room in the back, and the only comfortable place he could be was lying on the floor because there was no bed available, and there was chairs, but he didn't want to sit in the chair, so he lied on the floor, just a flat floor. And when the doctor came in, which was this, very young doctor, very seeming to be in a rush position, doctor who was absolutely I don't know, maybe overworked, maybe handling a lot of patients that night. I'm not sure, whatever. But what he came in is the first thing that he said was, he looked at my father. I was sitting right beside him. I was sitting on the chair when my dad was lying on the floor. And he turned to my father and he said, how much have you had to drink today, sir? It was first, he didn't even say hello. Now, my father, he's a judge. He's a notable Winnipegger that almost every single, even at the time the TRC was just going on, was on the news virtually every night. This was somebody who, at the very minimum, was not clearly recognized by the doctor. All the doctor saw was a drunk Indian on the ground. No, not how are you doing today, sir? My name is this. What symptoms do you have? Why are you lying on the floor? None of that. It's like, how much have you had to drink today, sir? And that's settler colonialism. Could we blame the doctor? Sure. But the doctor also was taught by someone. The doctor was also part of a system that facilitated that behavior. The doctor is part of an entire training at the university that never got that or gauged that, or maybe said to him, maybe don't think of it, Native people, as drunks the first time you meet them. And so all of these kinds of things go into what we know as settler colonialism, which then goes to the third theme of what I wanted to talk about, which is the history of Winnipeg. Now, for those of you, I did point out, Trevor was listing off my book. I have a book out myself. This is called Shameless Self-Promotion. And this is my book right here. I'm actually going to go speak on that in my other keynote shortly, so I brought a copy. It's brand new in paperback. But what I wrote about is, what I said was, the history of Winnipeg is a very complicated one. We are the first province. We are the first treaty. We are Canada's first footstep after Confederation. All of the major events, including the railway, start in Winnipeg. They are all headed towards Winnipeg. And of course, the first footstep of the country, the first moment of settler colonialism that Canada evokes itself on is in Winnipeg. It's in which the quelling of the provisional government led by the Red River Métis and Louis Riel, and the promise that all the Métis will get scrip, and then it's a lie. Canada steals all the land and pushes First Nations through treaty onto small plots of territories, and then never recognizes for nearly 100 years any Indigenous land claims that are not fairly given, that are negotiated during treaty. We're still working on that, called treaty land entitlement on the prairies. Now, when you are the first of all of the major steps that Canada has taken in relation to Indigenous peoples, you, as they point out, as McCallum and Perry point out in the book, we have the worst manifestations of that brutality. And the outcome of that is over-incarceration in the justice system, more children in the child welfare system than there was ever in residential schools, poverty, addictions, suicide, and then, of course, attitudes coming from all of that, which is that that's all normal. Like everything about the treatment of Indigenous peoples, putting them onto reserves. And if you were to talk about right now in 2025, that literally their homes are on fire in northern Manitoba. And we have 17,000 people, most of them Indigenous, evacuated from their community and put into Winnipeg. And we are discussing building more pipelines. Like that climate change doesn't have a role to play in the evacuation and burning of Indigenous communities. Like the fact that that's not like connecting is exactly the whole point of the history of Winnipeg. In that we have a challenge in that we've been at this very painful process of Canada dominating, pushing itself upon, trying to assimilate and eradicate Indigenous peoples to get them out of the way, to build a country, to build an economy, to try to, in these days now, the excuse is, well, the United States is coming, so we have to move quicker on pipelines and we have to move quicker on resource development projects. Well, all of that has resulted in deep-seated conflict with Indigenous peoples. That conflict comes from ignorance, or worse off, terrible propaganda and lies that have been taught about Indigenous peoples, like chiefs are corrupt and make too much money, or that First Nations are cesspools of violence and destruction, and Indigenous men are evil. And we'll get to that last one, which is with the final theme of this book. Now, of course, if you've been at this the longest, you also have come up with solutions the longest. And that's where I think Winnipeg enters, because Winnipeg is a Cree word that talks about the algae, talks about the life that's in the water. That's what the Winnipeg means. It's talking about the life of the flow, the dirty water, and it's talking about the algae. Winnipeg has always been a place of life, because we are at the bottom of this massive funnel system. And that's what I talk about in my book, which is that people have come up with solutions for fighting the most powerful force, the most difficult struggle of all time, which is not settler colonialism, it's the winter. You know what the hardest part of Winnipeg is? The winter. It's not racism. Racism's a cinch if you can handle the winter. You know what's second place? Mosquitoes. It's like mosquitoes are terrible in Manitoba. Indigenous peoples for a long time figured out how to live in a place that is very harsh in the winter. It's very difficult to find food. Try hunting bison or face off against the bears or chasing the deer, or, like Indigenous peoples figured it out. And then they taught the newcomers, and they brought the newcomers into our lodges and showed them where to live. And I mean, it's almost like, newcomers got this gift wrapped experience of thousands of years of knowledge of how to live here. And it was like we walked people through and said, oh, this is how you do it. And so, yeah, I think one of the easiest things ever is if somebody prepares a house for you and prepares a meal for you and prepares a beautiful place for you to sleep and to live. I mean, what a gift. And then said at the end, oh, let's live together. That's a treaty. So my point of it is that Indigenous peoples have always maintained that spirit, which is to engage those around us and try to figure things out. It's not always pretty. It's not always perfect. People war, people conflict, but you will find more solutions to racism in Winnipeg than you will find racism. That's my personal belief. Some people may argue with me on that. And this is going up on YouTube, I think. So I'm sure people will probably write me an evil, angry email and say, oh, well, you're a privileged professor in an institution. Sure. But I've also worked in downtown poverty for 30 years. I've worked on the streets of Winnipeg. I've worked in social justice agencies. I've also been an activist and organized marches. I've also been a person who has been writing about the city for a very long period of time, way before I was a columnist in Native newspapers in the downtown core, going back to 2000. My point of it is that I have a lot of experience in that place, and I can say that there are so many solutions. I would take 4 days, 5 days straight of just listing them all off for you, of all the different solutions that I see in the city of Winnipeg of people encountering racism, engaging it, and then trying to figure it out, trying to create a life anyways, and trying to endure the winter. Now, I tell you that because that is what the history of Winnipeg represents, but the worst manifestation is when people lose, because in a struggle, in a war, in a battle, there are casualties. And Brian Sinclair is one of those cases. One of the most worst, terrible instances of racism in Winnipeg history, right up there with the worst aviation disaster in Winnipeg history is in 1972. It's the crash of the Linwood on Linwood Avenue by 8 residential school students who were flying home. They never should have been in that plane in the first place. They should have been with their families, but they were forced to be on a plane in far off Canadian southern towns, and they crashed because of racism. I can keep listing them off, but I'll tell you one other one. A guy named William Amu, who just around this same time or shortly after the killing of Brian Sinclair, was killed in the Winnipeg Remand Center. But after guards were poking fun, making fun, and saying racist things to him, he fought back and said things to them. It escalated, and then they choked him to death, very similar to what happened to George Floyd. Almost the exact same thing. They crushed his windpipe. And he never should have been facing off against Winnipeg prison officers, because what he should have done is he should have been in a situation in which he was safe, or that he was treated better. At the very minimum, if he made it into jail. But I actually think way before that, he should have been taught and mentored by other people in society that he was valuable and important, that he didn't turn to a life of crime. And Brian Sinclair is the manifestation of all of that. A double amputee, experienced poverty. He's a non-status Indian, which means that you are double whammied. You don't have any First Nations to help you, but then you're also living in a society that's profoundly racist, and that will see you as not worthy and see you not present. And then therefore, very logically, he lives in the downtown core, depends on local social justice agencies like Main Street Project or Salome in the case of the book where he stayed. And then his body starts giving out, because being a wheelchair, an amputee in a wheelchair in the downtown core means you are exposed to all the elements, exposed to terrible food. You're at the mercy of many other people, often very high cholesterol, high sugar, high. And then, of course, there's the fact that you're traumatized and you're experiencing all of this pain. And so you may or may not become a person using alcohol or drugs, which Brian Sinclair wasn't. He was a person that was volunteering in the very place in which he lived. And for all intents and purposes was a person who worked very, very hard to try to be a good human being to others. And still not good enough. Ends up in the ER and dies from the poison, the bile that was created as a result of him sitting there for 34 hours in 2008. Now, I'm not going to go through the case of the trial, but the dehumanization of Indigenous peoples in the healthcare system is a very real thing. I've written lots about this, and I actually wrote about this in terms of my father's experience most recently, but I also wrote about it during the COVID-19 pandemic. Yeah, I agree with you, Mary. Tina Fontaine is also another manifestation of an outcome that it comes from a belief system that Indigenous peoples don't matter. And so, you know, I'm sure you probably, the bulk of, whenever I talk about Brian Sinclair, or I talk about the healthcare system, people want to talk about some of the intricacies of where the healthcare system has failed. Indigenous peoples in particularly, but I'll just say two things and then we'll move on to the last theme and then I'll open it up for your other conversation here. So the first is that Indigenous peoples disproportionately use the healthcare system in Manitoba. We have more cancers, we have more diabetes, we have more addiction issues, we have more issues involving amputees, long-term chronic cases of health. We're using heart units, we're using dialysis units, we're using ERs. Like if you go to the ER in HSC, all of the people from the north get funneled there. So if any person from the north comes into the city, they're immediately funneled to Health Science Center because Health Science Center is set up for federal funding. If you go to any other facility within Winnipeg, they're going to have trouble having your services paid for, because if you're a status Indian, they have to phone Ottawa, and if that's a Sunday night, you're going to have trouble getting a hold of somebody in order to get your services paid for. HSC is directly set up for that, so everyone's going to get funneled to HSC, and that means that you've got all of those issues condensed in one space. It's like ground zero of the worst impacts of Canada's racism right there. And so that's one, when you put Indigenous peoples into the healthcare system, the next thing happens. People then who are working in the healthcare system then begin to become callous to those intricacies, and they deny humanity. Like if the process of colonialism has been to deny humanity, to treat people as objects or to treat people as cattle. That's the Royal Proclamation of 1763, which is that they're not human beings anymore, they're generally livestock. That Canada has always treated Indigenous peoples as things to farm around and take their children or exploit them for the land or whatever it might be. And so that happens in an ER, in a healthcare facility, when you drive everybody to the same place. And then second is that dehumanizes. It also creates a sense that dehumanization is the norm. So in the healthcare system, to treat someone, an Indigenous person, like a human being is to be truly radical. So that's when you start to see little things, like, for example, at the St. Boniface Hospital, an egregious problem needs an egregious solution. If Indigenous peoples are so radically treated so terribly, and then therefore it becomes normalized, then we have to double down on treating people normally. And what do we mean by that? Services that are particularly geared towards focusing on Indigenous peoples, which is not extra. Like, for instance, all the conversations around Indigenous specific units in hospitals, none of that is extra. Like, people have a misunderstanding that Indigenous people get all these extra free things. No, the reason that there are these extra things is because Canada is so profoundly racist that you have to double down on the extra things to bring things to normal. And that's the challenge. The challenge is that there is an ignorance around the basic parameters of the healthcare system, of how profoundly racism, or how ground zero that racism has then collected all these people and they're experiencing it all together. That also creates a dehumanization as the norm. So that means you got to double down on humanity. You got to double down on making sure that nurses and doctors are treating people like human beings. And of course, that's insulting for doctors and nurses, and because they think that the normal is okay. They're like, oh, we treat people like human beings. Probably not. You're not. And that doesn't mean you're bad doctors and nurses, because we aren't talking about individuals. We're talking about settler colonialism. But to deal with settler colonialism, you have to have people who are cognizant and aware that settler colonialism is taking place, which brings me to the fourth part. Now, the underdiagnosed problem in Canadian society, or the least aware issue, is what is brought up in this book. And it's why I didn't list off Tina Fontaine as one of those examples, not because she isn't a vitally important part of the story of racism in Canada against Indigenous peoples. I was very active in making sure that her memory was a part back when I organized marches in downtown. But it's that there is a severe underdiagnosed problem in Canadian society, and it is the issue of murdered and missing, mistreated, and targeted Indigenous men and boys and male-presenting Two-Spirit people. I'm reading a report right now for Movember, if you know the mustache people. And we have just documented the massive cases of undiagnosed, misunderstood problems that Indigenous men are experiencing in Canada. And the worst cases, of course, are in high proportional Indigenous populations: Nunavut, Northwest Territories, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Northwestern Ontario, BC. These are really high areas in which Indigenous men are experiencing the most amount of not just poverty, homelessness, addiction, but then therefore premature death, suicide, more death by interactions with police. It's just that we don't call the treatment of Indigenous men a national crime like we do with women or Two-Spirit people, and we should. Because if you were to add up all the murdered and missing Indigenous men that we don't call murdered and missing, but are absolutely murdered and missing, we would have more than often situations that we call national inquiries for. It's just that we call those murders bar fights, suicides, encounters with police, encounters with prison guards, men that just go missing for, we say, oh, it's no big deal, it's whatever, even though their family's like, no, they haven't been seen for 3 months. And the family, oh, they're just off, probably working in BC or something, or working somewhere, ran off with somebody or whatever. And so that's the third issue of this book, which is that the undiagnosed issue of the treatment of Indigenous men really becomes clear with Brian Sinclair. And that's what Adele Perry and Mary Jane McCallum, my colleagues, point out in this book. It is a severely undiagnosed problem in this country, the way in which Indigenous men are ground zero for not even being seen as existing, that people can walk around them for 34 hours and say, no, not worth the time. And even when people point out that they haven't moved for 12 hours, 13, 14, 15 hours, that they're in the exact same spot, and then the family that left the night before and came back the next day and said, why is he still in the exact same spot, slumped over? The security guard checks him and he's suffering from rigor mortis, which means that he died hours and hours and hours before that. It is so profoundly clear that for Indigenous men, it's not, of course, we're not going to play the racism Olympics and go, men are worse than this or whatever, but it is absolutely the most undiagnosed problem in the country because it is the least understood. We have an inquiry to talk about the treatment of Indigenous women and girls, rightfully so. We have consistent and continual awareness or discussions around the treatment of LGBTQ2+ people, studies. I don't think we've scratched the surface of talking about the violence that Indigenous men have endured and continue to inherit and sometimes manifest in their own lives, harming themselves and others. And if we were to deal with and engage that issue in a meaningful, kind, generous way that is generative, I think we would be able to deal with so many more issues. And on top of that, we would also deal with the justice system, the child welfare system, the healthcare system in the case of this one, very profoundly. And that's what the end of that book is. So here's the five. The five things that I was talking about is the first is this is a really remarkable interaction between an Indigenous and a Canadian scholar doing something to work with the intricacies. It's really evidence of a kind of generation Gen Z or Gen X, Gen X. I'm Gen X, sorry. I have a Gen X kind of scholarship. My dad could not perform change. What he could do is recommend change. And being the first in the room, he himself was the manifestation of change, but he can't do whole-scale change. That's my generation's job. And that's what you're seeing in this book, which is the intricacies of a generational change that comes from elders that are in front of us. Second is settler colonialism, the definition of that or the term of it, or of thinking of it as a project, not as a moment. And then, of course, the history of Winnipeg and the real intricacies of talking about the history of Winnipeg and how there are not just racism, but there's also solutions within this book. And this book is a solution onto itself. Then the dehumanization of Indigenous peoples in the healthcare system, but then also the dehumanization of Indigenous men as a result of the example of the Brian Sinclair experience. So, or the experience of the death of Brian Sinclair. Now, I hope that all of that was helpful. That's the things that I kind of think about in the book. This is a very short book, so I'm sure that everybody probably did their own research or maybe Googled some stuff, and I'm happy to address and talk about it for a little bit. But big thanks for having me to be a part of this conversation, and I'll hand it back over to Trevor and Stan for doing some more conversational stuff. I hope the coffee shop wasn't too loud either.
Couldn't hear it at all. So just you. So thank you so much, Niigaan, Miigwech. I'll just a quick, not a question. I'll leave it open for questions in a moment. I don't want to hog time. Not that I don't have questions. I certainly do. But I just want to say thank you for, I guess you could, coming from Winnipeg, you know Winnipeg well. So really concretizing the reality and the beauty of Winnipeg, what makes it a special place. I lived there for a few years myself, including over winter, and that's I know it a little bit from that perspective. But thank you for situating. We talk about Indigenous realities and issues so much, and they can be so often generalized. So the beauty of this book and your presentation is it's localized within Winnipeg itself. And just thank you again for underlining the, I think it's really courageous. We don't hear much about this, misunderstood Indigenous men. I think that's really important to highlight. So Miigwech for that, for underlining that. So just with that, though, I leave it open for questions, observations, resonances from anyone. And I know there was a few things in the chat, so I don't know if you want to pick up on anything from there, Niigaan. Not questions per se, but.
Well, here's the thing is that I think, don't feel you have to ask me a question. If you just want to make a statement of the experience that you had reading the book, that is so valuable to, I think, others and also me. I don't feel that you have to ask me as some kind of expert. Your opinion is as important as valued as mine is. I just was asked to say a few words at the start, so I'm happy to do it. But I am happy to address a few things. I see some things in the chat, and then I just saw a bunch of hands go up, so I'm going to leave you to make your own statements and conversations. But thanks. I'll just point out thanks to Neil for quoting my book there. Yep. My piece in the Locked in the Bathroom is one of my favorite pieces, and I think a lot of people really appreciate that piece. I used to say it in lectures that I would give, and so many teachers groups asked me to write that story. That's what I ended up doing. So.
I think Janelle had a question, so maybe Janelle can be first and then Donna second.
Okay, my turn. Well, I really, really appreciate your time, Mr. Sinclair, for taking your time to discuss the book with us. I would like to share with you, like I'm a settler, and I've been pondering I really feel Canada has maintained a segregation of settlers and First Nations and Inuit and Métis. Because over the course, like I'm in my 60s, and over the course of my life, the only real meaningful encounters that I've had with the First Nations have been my own initiative, or if I responded to somebody else's initiative. I don't adhere to any conspiracy theories, but I really feel that the federal government is content to keep settlers and First Nations separate, because, as I'm sure you're aware, there are lots of good-natured Canadians who want to see the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action. We want to see them fulfilled, and we know that a few have been fulfilled. But, you know, here I am, like I was so enriched with every encounter. I used to live in Cape Breton in Nova Scotia, where there was a woman, Rita Joe, who was a poet. And she got to be known when her poetry was published. And I had the great privilege of going to see her in person in her community when she was still alive. She's passed away. But there just seems to be so few opportunities to really connect, you know, except as this whole book that we're looking at, the book that we're looking at became known because it became a newspaper article or media event. Otherwise, I would never have known anything about this death. So anyway, that's enough for me. You can comment and respond to what I say.
So where sorry, Janelle, where do you live?
I'm in unceded Mohawk territory of Montreal.
Oh, Montreal. Okay. Okay, okay. So I'll tell you a quick Montreal story then. Last Orange Shirt Day, well, I did a gig in Montreal, September 28th. And okay, so in Winnipeg, and I would say many cities on the prairies, starting at about September 15th or so to October 5th to 7th, in that neighborhood, usually a week or so after, you walk everywhere and all you see is orange shirts everywhere. It's like people wear them to work. I actually have about 30 orange shirts. I go through all of them in the span of like 2 weeks, because I wear like 2 or 3 a day, because I go to events and I'm often given one, or sometimes it gets sweaty and then you know what I mean? Like I did not see one orange shirt in Montreal. Here's my point.
We did have an orange shirt day. We did.
Oh, I'm sure. There's probably a few handfuls.
1 day.
Yeah, there's probably a few handfuls of people that probably do wear it on September 30th. I'm not saying that there isn't progressive people in Montreal. I mean, just spend some time engaging with activists in the French community and the sovereignty community, and even people in the national community. Like, Montreal is a great place, but it is not a great place in which people have had conversations about relationships with Indigenous peoples. But yet you are the most profoundly important, because the Grand Paix of Montreal was in 1701, the most important treaty that was ever formed between Indigenous peoples and, at the time, the Wemitakojawak, the French. But you probably didn't learn about that, did you? In 1701, Montreal is the most important site for Indigenous people. Well, part of that is a whole bunch of reasons. One is sovereignty in Quebec dominates, sucks the oxygen out of the room. Second is that there is rightful feelings amongst French people that they are not represented in Canada. So that does take up a lot of time and energy and focus. Absolutely. But also there is a history of Canadian violence involving Indigenous peoples. I just have to say Oka, and you know what I mean by that. So the relationship between Indigenous peoples and Canadians, and particularly Quebecers, is a very combative one. It's a very one that's very much about you people. And in fact, you have to go across the Mercier Bridge to really start to see Indigenous peoples, because they aren't welcome in Montreal. And so I'm not surprised you have this experience. But if you go, let's say, down the road to Ottawa, you start to see a little bit more. Out in not Toronto, because Toronto is in a deep state of ignorance, but also there's so many people there. But if you went to London, to Waterloo, to Niagara, to Windsor, you're going to see tons of relationships between Canadians and Indigenous peoples. And then if you go even north to Sault Ste. Marie, you'll see more and more. And then you get to Winnipeg, where 20% are Indigenous. And that means every single person, every day of their lives, works with, lives beside, or is dating or married to an Indigenous person. My first girlfriend, who I never got over, she's probably going to see this on YouTube, in my life, she is a young German Mennonite woman, who is now one of my best friends and has a wonderful family and, you know, a wonderful life now. But my point of it is that my best friend is Ukrainian. He's from a Ukrainian family. He's a second generation Canadian. His parents are grandparents and parents are first generation Canadians. My other best friend growing up is a Scottish guy, red hair, full red hair. Here's my point: is that every single person in Manitoba works with, lives beside, or is married to each other. And so in certain pockets of Canada, no matter what the government does, and I do agree with you that there are certain lines that are very stringent. Just go to any downtown Winnipeg or downtown Saskatoon, where I am right now. You can actually see the line of where Indigenous peoples are, and then where wealth begins. Or in the case of in northern communities, you can see where the cottages are, because that's where the paved road goes. And then suddenly the dirt road begins. You're like, oh, we're now on the reserve now, because reserves are chronically underfunded. So there's definitely lines that are drawn, and settler colonialism is real and all that kind of stuff. So I'm not surprised, though, it happens in Montreal or Quebec. I'm also not surprised when I see in Manitoba that everybody is just working with, living beside. And I did have, however, when I was growing up, people said to me, you know, I never met an Indigenous person. And they would say that to me. And I would say, that's not true, because you live in Manitoba. There are Indigenous peoples everywhere. It's just that you've been taught not to see them. Or suddenly when a person has a job and is a professional, is a professor in front of you, suddenly you see us because of power and privilege. So suddenly I get a PhD behind my name and suddenly people see me. You see the difference? So it's like that you see Indigenous peoples all the time in Winnipeg and Saskatoon, Thunder Bay, Regina, Regina, Edmonton, Calgary, Vancouver, but maybe don't see them as professionals or with having power. And I think that's the key is that we've been taught not to see people who are powerless.
Mm.
That's a good point. I wholeheartedly agree. Again, it's the same thing of shrugging off those that are less powerful, you know, because I mean, in Montreal, there is a location called Cabot Square. And so it's known as a place where Indigenous people gather. But I mean, you still, as a settler, you still have a choice. You can either connect with them as human beings, or you can just walk by and totally ignore people who are Indigenous. I mean, I do feel strongly about this. You have such patience, Mr. Sinclair, just an abundance of patience. Whereas I think myself, I'm just disappointed with the country that I call Canada.
Well, here's the thing is, absolutely. But there's really moments of hope. And the key is you have to look for them. Because sometimes we're taught, you know, like I work for a newspaper, and what do you think sells more newspaper? People die in a fire, or family helps another family. Like, what do you think would sell more newspapers? And that's why media is the way it is, because that media isn't that way because it's some conspiracy theory. Media is that way because that's what sells, right? And that's what, so that means you have to look for hope. I'll give you some hope right now. when Donald Trump threatens us, threatens our economy, threatens our sovereignty, says terrible things about Canada, it is fascinating to me that we do not turn in the direction of competitiveness, fighting, combativeness. We actually turn and say, okay, well, let's build a country now. Or let's turn to those systems that are most important to us, like healthcare, like our things that are we consider to be the most Canadian: multiculturalism, democracy. Who taught us those things? Hint, it wasn't Europeans. Europeans did not come up with the idea that the community matters more than the individual. That's an Indigenous idea. Indigenous peoples came up with the circle, a person that represents the circle that goes to other circles and converses with them. That's democracy, the parliamentary system. These are all Indigenous inventions. And so here's the key, is that when we get an external threat, we turn to our Indigenous roots to bring relationships to one another, to build an economy. And you know what's the most important thing for this agenda? If we're going to build projects, it will be, how do we work with Indigenous peoples? That will be what dictates the Ring of Fire. That was what dictates pipelines. That's what dictates any single thing that we're about to do in the country, hydroelectric dams. And here, and going back to Quebec for one more minute, this is a harsh lesson for Canadians. You know, Quebec says, oh, well, I'm not pleased with our treatment from Canada. And I think, you know, I have a lot of empathy for people who are in the sovereignty movement. I totally get why people feel that their language and culture is under attack. I get it. And I think that, you know, sovereignty is a really important conversation in Canada, but yet you cannot remove the land. Like, you can't just suddenly take the land, because when you remove Canada from the equation, the Crown, First Nations are going to want that land back, because we have a shared relationship with the Crown, and Quebec found that the hard way, that if they were to declare themselves sovereign, then all the land reverts to Indigenous peoples, and Alberta's finding out that lesson now.
Mhm.
And if you want to know hope, you tell me who's trying to build the country: people who are trying to keep it together, or people who are trying to tear it apart. So you tell me, who's more Canadian, Indigenous peoples or Danielle Smith?
Mm.
I would actually say, you know who, if you're a nationalist and you believe in this country, First Nations are fighting their butt for you. They're fighting for you. They are believing in this country, that staying with this country is better than, you know, creating all the conflict that separatism creates.
Mhm.
There's some hope for you.
It's a new perspective. Thank you. I wholeheartedly agree. Actually, just to kind of give other voices. Neil, or I think Donna had
Donna and Neil had
before
questions.
had a question.
Maybe Donna first and then Neil.
Thank you. Thank you. I want to say hello to Neil Maxwell and to Joe Gunn, who I know. We have had involvement previously, but I think that you're absolutely right, Niigaan. Hope is the answer. And I think that we have to reach out. We have to make ourselves available to Indigenous people. We have to let them know that we're allies and that we're honest and that we want to help. I think that in Hamilton, we have 15,000 urban Indigenous people, and we have a Six Nations Reserve just south of us with something like almost 30,000 people. So we're well acquainted with Indigenous people in this area. But I don't see, when I'm out, many people engaging. And the Hamilton Regional Indian Center is a wonderful place to go. They're welcoming. And I suspect it's that way in most cities, where if you walk in as a non-Indigenous person and you introduce yourself as wanting to get to know people there, they're very receptive. And I think the sense of humor runs deep with Indigenous people too. I saw that with you, Niigaan, when you mentioned something earlier, and you made me laugh. I think that Indigenous people are resilient, and we are very lucky to have them in this country. And they were here before us, and if we look at them in a way of them being able to sustain us through all the difficulties we have, we need to partner. And we try to do that in Hamilton. I'm approaching 80, and I've worked a lot of years on trying to get people educated. So at this point in my life, education is the key. And I think that that's what, and Neil is in the book club that I run, Indigenous Book Club. We have Indigenous speakers, and, you know, we try very, very hard, but I have hope, and I hope other people will pick up those threads, because I don't know if I'm going to see this in my lifetime, the reconciliation, but I certainly hope I see more than what I'm seeing now. Neil, do you have anything to say? Because Neil's always so eloquent in the book club.
Well, thank you. I guess you just passed the feather in our sharing circle to me. Thank you, Donna, and shout out to Jill as well. And Trevor, thanks for this. And Niigaan, thanks for joining us. Very interesting. What would I say? I love the way you started to frame this, Niigaan, which is that this is a lot bigger than an issue of just what white folks did and folks from Europe have done. And I love the way that you framed this, because all this stuff, the book itself, and a lot of what you've said is all about the fact that we're just not treating other people as human beings, right? And I do some work in the equality world, and there's this one, you know, the 1948 UN General Declaration on Human Rights has this wonderful phrase. I'll see if I can quote it. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. Free and equal in dignity and rights. I think that's it, or maybe I've misordered them. But that's the fundamental thing. And so the book, right in the title, this indifference, like indifference is worse than hatred, because indifference says you just don't matter enough that I hate you. And to me, there's a lot of stuff here. I think there's a whole bunch of stuff. I loved how Janelle talked about this, and you as well, about problems of the power structure, right? And he reminded me, there's some research I read a while ago about how powerful people, like, you know, rich people or powerful people in society, just don't typically look at others on the street. They don't see other people. They just, because everyone else is just a big mass. So I think there's problems of power relationships here. There's certainly just basic problems of stereotyping, right? We're not treating each other as equals. You know, stereotyping is just lazy thinking, because we just group people. We saw a bunch of drunk people and they happen to be Indigenous, so all Indigenous are drunks. You know, we see a lot of, you know, fill in the blanks, and it's just lazy thinking. But really, the reason I put my hand, and actually, again, you actually address this, because for all of the problems that we need to fix, they're in this book, and that you've talked about, and you talked about in your own book, Winnipeg, and congrats on that book. It's a wonderful book. All the problems we have to fix. I think that's part of why non-Indigenous have to pay attention to this issue. But I often come back to thinking that's enough reason that we should be paying attention to this issue. But the more important one, which is what you started to talk about, is how we can learn from Indigenous worldviews. So what you had to say, so the kind of interesting thing about equality is that, and you started to touch on this, is that a lot of these ideas of equality, the Europeans, it's been argued, got from Indigenous people. And I was going to actually mention, you sort of talked about some of these ideas, but John Ralston Saul wrote a book a while ago, and I just Googled it to pull it up so I didn't forget what he basically said, called A Fair Country. So this is like, what, 2010 or something? A long time ago. But he basically says, you know, Canada is a Métis nation. That, you know, what you were saying again about how, you know, people in Manitoba all are really close to Indigenous, and Indigenous are close to non-Indigenous. We argue the whole country and our value set, you know, peace, order, good government, things like that, were essentially Aboriginal Indigenous ideas. So anyway, that was kind of what I want to bring in the conversation. It's not so much a question there, but anyway, just leave that with that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Donna, Neil. Joe?
Yeah, Niigaan, a question that wasn't answered in the book to me is more strategic. Call out to you to suggest what a solution might look like. It's hard for Canadians to look at the healthcare system, which is our great difference from the United States, as not being universal and fair and better and so on. So the book is really, really important. And we saw even in Quebec with Joyce Echaquan and Joliette dying there, being poorly treated. So it's not just, of course, a Winnipeg problem. The solution, even reading the TRC, several recommendations that we're dealing with healthcare, and there are quite a few of them, there is a call for very distinct services for Indigenous people. So just your views on the solutions. Is it to call for changes in the healthcare system, which are supposed to be universally available to everybody, or should the policy solutions really be very, very distinct services to Indigenous people?
Maybe you would address that, or?
If you have an opinion, I was wondering.
So, okay, yeah, I didn't want to step on. I want to give other people chances to. Okay, the first 42 calls of the TRC are ground zero. Like they are the beginning points of treating people like human beings. So you should think of the first 42 calls as not reconciliation. The first 42 are to treat people like human beings. That's what the first 42 are. And just to bring people to a position of where we can start to use the R word, because 43 through 94 are all brand new things that have never been created before, and things that have never been done before, like a papal apology, or like the implementation of the United Nations Declaration. I see Jen talks about that, replacing the Indian Act with the United Nations Declaration. That's a whole conversation for another day of how to replace the Indian Act. You can't erase the Indian Act, you have to replace it, because constitutionally it would be a crisis then. But anyways, so that being said, there's a whole bunch of different ways that you can do that. But anyways, my point is that think of the TRC as those 5 elements of the first 42 calls: child welfare, health, justice, language and culture, education. That wasn't quite the right order. Justice is the last one. They're all strategically placed in the order in which we should deal with them. So child welfare is first. I think health is second, education, then language and culture, and then justice. That's the order that they're supposed to be dealt with. And while all 42 are crucial, one leads into the other. And so that's why they're listed in that very strategic way. That being said, these are emergency situations in almost every case. Like 90% of children in Manitoba, and very similarly in Saskatchewan, Northwestern Ontario, are taken away and put into the child welfare system. That's a friggin' crisis. Like that's an emergency. Like that's like right up there with forest fires burning down the province. Like think of the child welfare system in Manitoba as literally the province burning down. And so therefore we should have an equal response that we're having to forest fires, evacuations, money, dealing with this, right now, not kicking it down the curb to the next government. In the same way, over incarceration of men and women in jails, Indigenous women and men and women in jails, because, people are coming out more traumatized than they went into those systems. And for young people, I just explained to you the gang problem. Young people don't start gangs. They don't join gangs before they get into jail. They join gangs in jail because that's the protective method in which they are trying to live. They also grow to addiction, and then boom, they're on the streets and they're making difficult life choices while in those gangs because you can't escape them. I can just keep going. I can keep going. Anyways, so the solutions are all present to us. The political will isn't there. About a third of the TRC calls have never been picked up or started in, and some focus group somewhere and then didn't get picked up. But the better version of the TRC is the Royal Commission. And the better version of the Royal Commission is the Aboriginal Justice Inquiry. But none of those calls were picked up. The TRC is really the only inquiry or commission that's ever been picked up. And even that has been only moderately picked up. Don't get me started on the National Inquiry of Murder, Missing, Indigenous Women and Girls. 231 calls to action, barely a blip. I mean, the Prime Minister went on the news and said, oh, there is a genocide happening and Indigenous women, girls, Two-Spirit peoples are experiencing it the most. And the country went, anyways, and then just turned the page. Like if I declared a genocide is happening, if I said to you, okay, there's a bunch of people being killed right there, that means we all got to go do something about it. We should intervene. But instead, the Prime Minister said, hey, there's a bunch of people being killed right there. And anyways, so getting back to profit and capitalism. And so all the solutions are there. They're very much present. And I think that we don't really have to look very far. If you want one more shameless self-promotion, I wrote a column about the red dress alert. And if you want to know why the red dress alert is vital, it's because evacuees are coming into Winnipeg, and they're being preyed upon. Young women and girls and Two-Spirit peoples are being preyed upon by the forces in the city. And so therefore, many of those, there's very unsafe situations being created. And this is why the Red Dress Alert program, we're going to have somebody go missing. We're going to have somebody who's going to, years from now, we're going to find out about the violence and the issues that happen from the evacuation. And I know that because we just had 4 women killed by a serial killer in Winnipeg, and people talked about it and no one did anything for a long period of time. And then, of course, I can just say Robert Picton, and you know exactly what I mean of the worst manifestation of that. So,
thank you, Niigaan. I have a question too, and I put up my hand because I want to get in line. I'm a co-facilitator, but I also want to ask a question, and it's around the calls to action. And I don't know if you can answer this, but it's, professional development programs, training programs for doctors and nurses, and I think it was called Action 24 that was calling for the creation of anti-racism and implicit bias and cultural safety training programs for these professional organizations, such as for nurses and doctors and hospitals. I just wonder if you know how fruitful that call to action has it been attended to in any way? And I remember your father writing in his memoirs, many people have desires to work for truth and reconciliation. And they would come to your father asking for advice, and your father would say, well, what's your plan? Do you have a plan? And I just wonder if you know of any plans around this particular call to action that is a model that can be looked at. Because this book was written, not too long ago. And so I just wonder, if you know of any successful plans around this. You're muted.
around this particular issue of healthcare?
Yeah, in the training of doctors and nurses, for example.
Yeah, so the Brian Sinclair inquiry had a series of recommendations. And if you go to the Health Science Center today, and I know this because my uncle was there shortly after the Sinclair report came out, and my father was just recently in HSC, and so was my mother. They both passed away last year. I could tell you firsthand that there are recommendations that are implemented in the ER that are directly coming out of the Brian Sinclair recommendations. So like checking on people when they're asleep, having a numbering system so that every single person when they come in are accompanied and they know who was there and what they're there for. The triage system, which is much more monitored and surveilled. And then on top of that, there's also a time chart list of indicating how long people have to wait and what other facilities are worth going to. So the Brian Sinclair report did produce a number of recommendations. The healthcare system in Manitoba, though, is well documented as being very complicated. That's my nice way of saying broken, but it's a system that is still very, very difficult to engage with. I've written a number of times about this. The closing of ERs by the previous progressive conservative government for austerity measures, on top of the fact that there is a lot of units in Winnipeg that have very thin resources, very thin support, and so that's created an emergency situation, especially in the rural areas, where people are experiencing a great deal of pain. And what people are finding is that they're just not going to the doctor at all. And so that's creating a system of chronic problems. But there's been solutions to that. Urgent care facilities, facilities that have been that are more based in private I always think that one of the things that right-leaning governments want to do is sabotage the healthcare system so that it's an argument for private, of course. And you know, you can sit with that how you were, or you sit with that whether you agree with me or not on that. But I mean, I just explained to you what I think is going on in Alberta. It's the chronic attacks and assaults and nepotism that's going on within the firings and the mishandlings and the mismanagement of the Alberta healthcare system is quite evident. And it's certainly making a strong argument for private clinics. And that's not what Canada is supposed to be about. And Canadians need to stand up for that. Right. So I'll just say one other thing too. I have to go in a minute. I only have about 3 minutes left.
Yeah.
Neil, you mentioned indifference, and we talked about indifference. I put Pope Francis's apology. I think, you know, he points directly to indifference as the problem. We don't ask questions. We don't see people as human beings. And what he said at the Vespers, which Pope Francis, I'm a big fan of Pope Francis, the late Pope Francis, our great uncle who did some amazing things. I'm not a Catholic, but I think of Pope Francis as my uncle. He put the headdress on. And he definitely took a role within our lives as Indigenous peoples in this country. He said that the problem is that we don't see Indigenous peoples as having already the presence of God on their faces. That we know more about God we know as much about God as anyone else in creation. And so thinking that we are not civilized or that we don't know Jesus, we already knew Jesus before Jesus arrived. Or if you know, I'm talking about the Bible. We knew Jesus before the Bible arrived because we know love, we know kindness, we know generosity, we know those things. And so Jesus is would make a great Anishinaabe. And I think that, you know, if you gave him an orange shirt, Jesus would put it on. Like a good uncle would. That's what Pope Francis did. He said, I'm gifted this headdress. I'm going to put it on, or actually he didn't even put it on. Wilton Littlechild put it on for him, which tells you that we're not in your grandparents' time anymore. You are now in 2025, in which we all see each other and have to see each other, but we have to radically work at it. And that's what this book is ultimately all about. So I hope that was helpful to you. I hope it was useful, and
Thank you so
I apologize,
much.
but I got to run down here and find where I'm speaking. I send much love to everybody. I feel like I'm doing the Romper Room episode. Remember those shows? I see Donna, and I see Mary, and I see Mariette, and I see Janelle, and I see Anne, and I see Neil. And of course, there's Trevor and Stan. Thanks to you for organizing this.
Thank you so much.
Miigwech and Giga Wabma and Miniwa. That's what we say when we say goodbye. We'll see you down the road. We'll see you a little bit later. And so Giga Wabma and Miniwa, and take care, everybody.
Take care.
Take care.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Okay, Miigwech. Take care.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful evening.